My topic today is the New Zealand tertiary vocational education and training reforms and micro-credentials. The New Zealand current model of provision starts with children are 5 years old in what we call the primary sector. At 13 and 14 they move into the secondary education sector, and 15 to 18 they move into the senior secondary. In the senior secondary they're exposed for the first time to technical and vocational education, and they can follow this pathway through institutes or polytechnics and private training enterprises and wānanga to do certificates to master's degrees. They can also follow the traditional academic pathway from bachelor's to doctoral degrees at universities and wānanga. New Zealand has a very rigorous quality assurance and management system. First, all institutions need to be recognised by the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, which ensures that all organisations provide a sound and stable learning environment. All the qualifications they offer must be formally approved and registered on the New Zealand Qualifications Framework. And a third part of this is that there is continuous external evaluation and review of the organisations. At the heart of the system of New Zealand is the New Zealand Qualifications Framework, and this was one of the first frameworks in the world. The New Zealand Qualification Frameworks allow stakeholders to benchmark their level of achievement and make it easier for countries and regions to compare the qualifications offered by New Zealand with other qualifications around the world. The New Zealand Qualifications Framework is divided into 10 levels and covers a range of qualifications from certificates to doctoral degrees. The level is based on how complex the learning is, with level 1 certificate being the least complex and level 10 being the most complex. New Zealand Qualification Frameworks describes skills you'll learn at each level of the framework. New Zealand is a small geographically isolated nation that depends on international trade. This means that New Zealand needs to be prepared for an ever-changing future of training and retraining to remain competitive in a global economy. COVID-19 has had a significant impact, downsizing the tourism, travel, accommodation, recreation and hospitality industries and elevating the agricultural sector. This means there is an increased demand for initial industry training and current re-employee upskilling in primary industries. In this ever-changing environment, industries demanding that their existing workforce is able to be retrained to meet the advanced production processes that will add value to the products produced. They are demanding that educational institutes produce work-capable employees who are able to contribute immediately to business growth and profitability. Individuals are demanding the opportunities to upskill to obtain qualifications relative to industry and remain employable, or opportunities to gain competencies and certification in industry required skills to gain employment. Therefore, New Zealand needs a system of technical and vocational education that is simple to understand and navigate, responsive to the needs of learners and employers, and flexible enough to change as the future develops. So let's take a close look at the reform of vocational education in New Zealand. COVID-19 and the need to remain globally competitive has meant that the reform of vocational education aims to create a more sustainable TVET system for all New Zealanders. There are two focus areas. Focus 1 is industry and employers. Here, we need to create the right graduates with the skills needed, provide more support for employers and employees to improve their training provision. We need greater national consistency in the skills program and qualifications offered, and we need to encourage more employers to be actively engaged in vocational education. Focus 2 is the learners. We need to provide more support for learners while they are training that is more relevant to the work they undertake, and an easier pathway to continue learning if they need to move between regions or internationally. There are 6 key changes proposed. First is the creation of a Central New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology to make operational activities more efficient. Second is the creation of work development councils to advise on future skill need. Third is regional skills leadership groups to advise on skills required for each region. There will be centres of vocational excellence, which will investigate trends in vocational education. There will be increased support for workplace learning. There'll be unified system of funding, and there will be recognition of Māori. A key change is a change to the New Zealand Qualifications framework. It now becomes the New Zealand Qualification and Credentials framework. In this system, micro-credentials will be created, which are generally based on a directory of assessment standards that provides a framework to validate TVET qualifications and credentials awarded. They will still follow the traditional levels from 1 to 10. A key change in the system is that industry employers become the focus of all activity. Workforce development councils provide advice on workforce strategies and enable provision, and providers agree with the training and services that they should provide to industry and employers. The future provision of TVET sees a continuation of campus provision, that is institutional provision, but there is a growing emphasis on workplace facilitation. There will be recognition of training with the traditional certificates and diplomas, but there will be the additional recognition through innovative approaches like micro-credentials. Again, there is an increased focus on recognition of the credentialing of workplace learning. So let's take a further in-depth look at micro-credentials. Micro-credentials and 1+6 certificates offered in China have a very similar focus. A micro-credential and a 1+6 certificate recognises the achievement of a specifically defined outcome that includes knowledge, skills and attitudes that are significant and stand alone. This independent acknowledgement of accomplishments through the award of a 1+6 certificate or a micro-credential serves to enhance and extend the depth of existing qualifications and the professional standing of employees. Micro-credentials are based on outcomes and competency. This is often referred to as outcomes-based education. What it basically based on is that workplace tasks can be described in terms of outcomes that successful workers in the occupation can perform repeatedly. All outcomes have direct implications on the knowledge, skills and attitudes that workers and trainees must acquire in order to perform workplace tasks correctly. The design of micro-credentials are focused on 3 key questions. 1. How will the employee know what the learners have learned and is able to do in employment? 2. What outcomes, competencies does the learner need to be able to demonstrate to be employed? And 3. What other outcomes, competencies does the learner need to acquire to be effective in the workplace? There are 4 key focus areas for micro-credential development. 1 is those discipline or industry-specific competencies that a student must be able to complete. For example, the use of a particular piece of machinery. There are transferable competencies that they've learned elsewhere, for example, mathematics or using a tape measure. There are the work-ready technical competencies, such as being on time, being able to follow health and safety procedures, and there are work-ready personal competencies, such as communication and teamwork. Each of these will allow us to develop a micro-credential or a 1+6 certificate. In essence, micro-credentials add value. They add value to the cultural aspects of a country, where they shared experience, ways of knowing and relationships. The government has a highly skilled workforce that is able to increase gross domestic product. Individuals have greater chances of employment and recognition. Institutions have greater learner success and increase their institutional brand. And industry gets a greater return on investment, gets increased productive capacity, and there's an increase in quality. But for micro-credentials to be internationally recognised, we need to benchmark them against international standards. This enables us to provide transparency in training provision that confirms with agreed international frameworks and learning outcomes, provide a common understanding of the procedures of credit validation, accumulation and transfer, provide a detailed taxonomy so we can describe the levels of the credentials, and harmonises the validation of credentials and certificates across the world. Internationally, the United Nations have developed world reference levels. These world reference levels are based on the factors commonly found in the level descriptors, qualifications frameworks, and other structures which define the levels of qualifications, credentials, and competencies. By using these world reference levels, we're able to internationalize any micro-credential we offer. The use of world reference levels allows us to benchmark the New Zealand qualifications accreditation system with international competitors. We want to be assured that our system meets international systems, so we know that our students, when they graduate, are globally competitive. And this is some initial work we've been undertaking. By using the world reference levels as a guide, we're able to align our 1+X certificates and micro-credentials against the levels identified both within the New Zealand qualifications framework and also at the levels identified in the world reference levels, from basic, associated with basic studies and simple work roles, to competent, the capability to carry out relatively simple and dependent tasks, and then moves forward to the most complex tasks and responsibilities. So let us look at micro-credentials and the Sino-New Zealand Strategic Partnership. The New Zealand-China Model Programme was agreed to as a commitment in the Strategic Educational Partnership Agreement between New Zealand and China. It involves both the Chinese Ministry of Education and the New Zealand Ministry of Education. It wants to build capability and capacity of the TVET sectors with research and collaboration. A key feature of this endeavour is what we call the credit accumulation and transfer systems. We need to identify what is the training need for students in the TVET system in China and New Zealand. We need to identify the knowledge, skills and attitude that will make them globally competitive. We need to be able to ensure that the credits awarded and the certificates awarded are validated. Learners can then store these in a transfer and accumulation system and use them to gain employment. The key building block of credit accumulation and transfer systems is calculating the actual number of credits that should be awarded for an identified activity. Part of the initial research undertaken in this area was focused on parametric modelling and cognitive load theory. Basically, parametric modelling says we are able to identify key factors on the time that a learner will spend reading, writing, completing tasks. And from this, we're able to then generate what we call a cognitive load calculation. So if we know the amount of time a learner will spend inputting information into their sensory memory, we're able to then calculate the amount of time working memory will rehearse and practice the activities given to them. They will then store successful strategies in their long-term memory for future use. Each of these activities take time, and through parametric modelling, we're able to identify the amount of time that is spent. Let's take an example of constructing an electrical circuit. For this process, we are going to spend 5 hours giving lectures, and we're going to have 5 workshops. We can see that in parametric modelling, we know that the time factor that students need to prepare for a lecture, to engage in the lecture, and then to reflect on the activities of the lecture is a time factor of 3. For workshops, the time factor is 2. In our particular task, we are going to get them to observe the construction of electrical circuit, which will take 30 minutes, and then we will ask them to perform their own construction of an electrical circuit, and this will take 40 minutes. We are also going to get them to prepare for a test, and this preparation time will be approximately 4 hours. In summary then, we can see that the total workload for this particular task is 36.88 hours. In New Zealand terms, this is 3.6 credits. To maintain quality in micro-credentials, we need to ensure that there is a consistency in delivery, that there is a consistency in assessment, and that evidence can be quickly compared to ensure that students in one area or one region or one country are the same quality as students in other areas. Initial work in the digital delivery and assessment platforms have been focused on what we call certification sites, where people can engage in upskilling to make sure that they're continually competent in the tasks they are to perform. In this particular site, each professional is able to access a range of modules to bring them up to date with the latest information on forage crops or fundamentals of irrigation, for example. Let's take this in a little bit more detail. If we look at the fundamentals of irrigation, we actually see that the students have to engage with materials. They have to input these materials, work through the materials to create an understanding. We then ask them to perform particular tasks through an assessment to gauge their competence. We are able to gauge the competency of each individual through a score that they receive for each question, but we're also able to compare individuals to ensure that there is a consistency in delivery and consistency in performance in this profession. At the end of the module, each person is granted a certificate of achievement that they can use for their professional advancement, and in this case the credit value is 4 hours. We also need to have an holistic assessment approach which gathers the appropriate evidence of competency. And we know that this assessment approach must measure knowledge, their actual competence, their performance, and the repeatability of that performance. This is from novice to proficient. Our initial work in holistic assessment and the gathering of evidence has been around the development of assessment worksheets and templates. These worksheets and templates will ensure the consistencies of the assessments undertaken and that we are able to gather the appropriate evidence to ensure the student has completed the task set. Each template begins with a definition of how they should be used. We then provide a marking and reporting sheet for participants' use. This ensures all participants receive the appropriate information on their performance. We are now in the process of developing micro-credentials for designers, teachers and evaluators. This will ensure consistency in design, consistency in assessment, consistency in the learner experience, and consistency in the impact of the micro-credential on changing workers' attitude. This is the end of the presentation, and I look forward to your comments and questions during the second phase of the conference.